Welcome to Truth Behind History, where we uncover the fascinating, the dramatic, and sometimes the downright unbelievable stories from the past. Today, we're diving into one of the most legendary and controversial figures in history, Alexander the Great. But here's the real question. Was he a visionary leader, a tactical genius who reshaped the ancient world? Or was he simply a reckless conqueror driven by ambition and ego? Well, my friends, history isn't black and white, and Alexander's story is filled with contradictions. On one hand, he was a brilliant military strategist who built one of the largest empires in history before he was even 33. On the other, he made some, let's say, questionable decisions, ones that led to both great victories and bitter betrayals. His influence still echoes through time, but the debate about his legacy rages on even today. So let's break it all down. From his military conquest to his political maneuvering, and even the mystery surrounding his death, we'll explore what made Alexander such a fascinating and at times infuriating figure. Buckle up, because this is going to be a wild ride. All right, let's start with the basics. Who exactly was Alexander the Great? Born in 356 BCE, Alexander wasn't just any ruler, he was a force of nature. He inherited the throne of Macedon at just 20 years old after the assassination of his father, King Philip II. And instead of spending his youth partying, like most young royals might, he embarked on a military campaign that would shake the very foundations of the ancient world. But here's where things get interesting. Alexander was a leader of contradictions. One moment, he was a fearless warrior, charging headfirst into battle alongside his men. In the next, he was making strategic political marriages and absorbing foreign cultures into his empire. Was he an open-minded visionary or just incredibly pragmatic? We'll let you decide. And the impact? Oh boy! His influence didn't just disappear after his death. His empire's cultural and political footprint is still visible today, from the spread of Hellenistic culture to the very cities that still bear his name. So now that we've set the stage, let's dive into what really made Alexander tick, his military strategies. Because let's be honest, you don't conquer half the known world without some serious battlefield skills. Now let's talk about how Alexander redefined the art of war. This guy didn't just win battles, he transformed how wars were fought for centuries to come. If you were a general in ancient Rome, medieval Europe, or even Napoleon's era, chances are you studied Alexander's tactics. So what made his army so effective? Four key things. First, the Macedonian phalanx. Picture this: a massive wall of soldiers, tightly packed together, wielding spears up to 18 feet long. These weren't just any spears. These were sarissas, and they gave Alexander's men the ability to strike at the enemy before the enemy could even get close. His father, Philip II, actually developed this formation, but Alexander perfected it. His soldiers were disciplined, drilled, and nearly impenetrable when in formation. The phalanx didn't just fight, it crushed and overwhelmed anything in its path. But Alexander didn't stop at defensive formations. He was all about speed and aggression, which brings us to cavalry shock tactics. The companion cavalry, Alexander's elite horsemen, weren't just there for show. These were fast, highly trained warriors who could smash through enemy lines like a battering ram. And here's the best part. Alexander led them himself. He wasn't one of those generals who sat back on a hill watching the battle. No, he was right there in the action, leading charges, striking at weak points, and causing absolute chaos in enemy ranks. And when the enemy hid behind walls, that's where siege warfare innovations came in. Most armies at the time would see a massive fortified city and either walk away or lay siege for years, hoping the defenders would eventually run out of food. But Alexander, he had zero patience for that. Instead, he built battering rams, siege towers, and even floating bridges to get his troops over walls. The most insane example, the Siege of Tyre. This was a city on an island, completely surrounded by water. Most generals would have just given up. Alexander, he built a land bridge into the sea, literally created a new piece of land, so his army could march across and take the city by force. Who does that? And finally, the most underrated weapon in Alexander's arsenal, psychological warfare. He knew that sometimes the best way to win a battle was to make sure it never happened. Before attacking, he would spread rumors about how massive his army was, how he was divinely favored, or how resistance was useless. He used diplomacy to turn enemies into allies, and in many cases, entire cities just surrendered without a fight because they were too terrified to face him. And the ones that did fight, they learned very quickly why that was a bad idea. So as you can see, Alexander wasn't just a great warrior, he was a military mastermind. And now that we understand his strategy, let's see these tactics in action by looking at some of his greatest battles. Now let's talk about the battles that cemented Alexander's reputation as one of the greatest military commanders in history. Because strategy is one thing, But executing it on the battlefield, that's where legends are made. First up, the Battle of Granicus in 334 BCE. This was Alexander's first major showdown against the Persians, and he wasn't about to play it safe. The Persian army had positioned itself on the far side of the Granicus River, expecting that the river would slow Alexander down. Most generals would have waited, assessed the situation, maybe looked for a better crossing. But Alexander? Nope. He charged straight in, leading his cavalry through the water and into the enemy ranks. Chaos erupted. His men cut through the Persian cavalry, and before long, the Persian line collapsed. With that victory, Alexander had secured Asia Minor, and more importantly, sent a very clear message. I'm here, and I'm not playing around. Then just a year later, we get the Battle of Issus in 333 BCE. This time, he wasn't just facing Persian forces. He was up against the Persian king himself, Darius III, and Darius had the numbers. We're talking possibly hundreds of thousands of troops against Alexander's much smaller army. But here's the thing. Darius made a fatal mistake. He chose to fight in narrow terrain, which meant his larger army couldn't spread out and use its full strength. Alexander took full advantage. He led a devastating cavalry charge straight at Darius, and guess what? Darius panicked and fled the battlefield. Imagine being the king of the Persian Empire, and your army is still fighting, but you just run. Not a great look. With that victory, Alexander gained control over Syria and the Levant, and now he had his sights set on Egypt. But before he could take Egypt, there was one problem: Tyre. The city refused to surrender, and unlike other cities, Tyre was on an island, completely surrounded by water. Alexander could have moved on, but instead he decided that Tyre had to fall. Enter the Siege of Tyre, one of the most insane sieges in ancient history. Since he couldn't sail his army into the city, Alexander literally built a land bridge out into the ocean, brick by brick, until his troops could march across and breach the walls. 7 months of brutal fighting later, the city fell. Tyre had been considered unconquerable, but Alexander made sure nothing stood in his way. And then, the grand finale, the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE. This was it, the big one. The final decisive showdown between Alexander and Darius III for control of the Persian Empire. Darius had learned from his past mistakes. This time he picked wide, open terrain where his massive army could spread out and use its full strength. But Alexander had also learned. He used feints, quick cavalry movements, and precise attacks to create gaps in the Persian lines. And once that opening appeared, he went straight for Darius again. And just like at Issus, Darius ran for his life. With his king gone, the Persian army collapsed. The battle was over. The empire was Alexander's. From a young Macedonian king to ruler of the known world, Alexander had done the impossible. But here's the thing. Conquering an empire is one thing. Ruling it, that's an entirely different challenge. And as we'll see next, Alexander didn't just want to be a conqueror. He wanted to change the world. Conquering the world is one thing. Ruling it, that's a whole different challenge. And Alexander wasn't just some warlord moving from battle to battle. He wanted to create something lasting. He didn't just want an empire. He wanted a unified world, a place where different cultures could blend together under his rule. One of the biggest ways he did this was through cultural fusion. Unlike other conquerors who would burn cities to the ground and force their own ways on people, Alexander took a different approach. He embraced the best parts of the cultures he conquered. In Persia, he wore Persian clothing and adopted some of their royal customs. He even encouraged his soldiers to marry Persian women to blend Greek and Persian traditions. Now, was this genuine respect, or was it just a smart way to keep his new subjects in line? That's up for debate. But either way, this blending of cultures led to the Hellenistic era, a time when Greek philosophy, art, and science spread across 3 continents. And speaking of spreading influence, let's talk about city foundations. Alexander loved naming cities after himself. I mean, if you've conquered half the known world, why not leave a few Alexandrias behind, right? In total, he founded over 20 cities, the most famous being Alexandria in Egypt. This wasn't just some random city. It became one of the greatest centers of learning in the ancient world, home to the legendary Library of Alexandria, which sadly did not have a great survival rate. But ruling an empire this massive wasn't easy, so Alexander had to figure out administrative control. Instead of just throwing Greek officials in charge of everything, he took a mixed approach, combining local leaders with Greek governors to keep things running smoothly. This way, people felt like they still had some control over their own lands, even though they were technically under Alexander's rule. And of course, what's a great empire without a little propaganda? Alexander didn't just want to be a king, He wanted to be seen as divine. He claimed he was the son of Zeus, and he made sure that image was spread far and wide. Statues, coins, ceremonies, you name it, he used it to secure loyalty. Because at the end of the day, the best way to keep an empire together isn't just with armies, it's with belief. But not everyone was on board with Alexander's vision. In fact, the way he ruled created tension among his own men. And as we'll see next, the very qualities that made him great would also lead to his downfall. For all his brilliance, ambition, and military genius, Alexander's story doesn't end in glory. In fact, his downfall was just as dramatic as his rise. Because when you push boundaries the way he did, when you rule through sheer force of will, eventually something has to give. One of the first cracks in his empire, paranoia and betrayal, as Alexander gained more power, he also became more distrustful of those around him. He started seeing plots and conspiracies everywhere, whether they were real or not. He executed close advisors and even longtime generals, some of the very men who had helped him win his greatest victories. At one point, he even killed his friend Clytus the Black, the man who had saved his life in battle, during a drunken argument. Imagine that. One moment, you're toasting with the king of the world. The next, he runs you through with a spear. Not exactly the mark of a stable ruler. Then, there was cultural resistance. Alexander wanted to merge Greek and Persian cultures, and in theory that sounds great. But in reality, his own men hated it. These were Macedonian warriors, battle-hardened, fiercely loyal, and they had spent their lives fighting Persians. Now Alexander was telling them to act Persian, dress Persian, even marry Persians. Many of his soldiers saw this as betrayal, and they weren't afraid to show it. Morale started breaking down, and so did their trust in Alexander. And then, the biggest problem of all, succession. Alexander had conquered the world, but he didn't leave behind a clear heir. When he died, his empire fractured almost immediately. His top generals, known as the Diadochi, didn't rally behind a new leader. Instead, they turned on each other, carving up his empire in a brutal series of civil wars. Within a few decades, Alexander's once unified world was gone, split between rival kingdoms, each one claiming to be the true heir of his legacy. And finally, the greatest mystery of all, his death. Alexander died in 323 BCE at just 32 years old, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. But how? That's the million-dollar question. Some say it was fever or disease, malaria, typhoid, maybe even West Nile virus. Others believe he was poisoned, possibly by one of his own men. And then there's the more dramatic theory that he had some kind of genetic illness that had been slowly killing him. Whatever the cause, one thing is certain, his death marked the end of an era. Alexander had spent his entire life chasing immortality through conquest. But in the end, even he couldn't escape the grip of time. Or could he? Because while his empire crumbled, his legacy didn't just survive, it grew. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about next. So after all the battles, the conquests, the betrayals, and the glory, what was Alexander's legacy? Was he a military genius, a reckless conqueror, or something in between? Let's break it down. First, there's no denying that Alexander revolutionized warfare. His tactics didn't just win battles, they set the standard for military strategy for centuries. Generals from Rome to Napoleon to modern warfare theorists have studied his campaigns, learning from his ability to outmaneuver, outthink, and overwhelm his enemies. If you've ever heard of the phrase divide and conquer, you can thank Alexander. Then there's the Hellenistic world, the cultural explosion that happened because of his empire. Greek philosophy, art, language, and science spread across 3 continents, mixing with Persian, Egyptian, and Indian traditions. This wasn't just about Greek culture taking over. This was a fusion of civilizations that shaped everything from architecture to astronomy. If you're a fan of Stoic philosophy, the Pythagorean theorem, or the foundations of Western science, you're looking at Alexander's indirect influence. But it wasn't all positive. His empire didn't last. After his death, political fragmentation ripped apart the territories he fought so hard to unify. The Diadochi, his top generals, descended into war, dividing his empire into warring states. This power struggle reshaped the ancient world, paving the way for the rise of Rome and the eventual fall of Greek dominance. In a way, Alexander's ambition was so vast that even his own empire couldn't contain it. And finally, there's the timeless debate. Was Alexander truly great? Some see him as the ultimate visionary, a man who dreamed of a united world and nearly achieved it. Others see him as a ruthless conqueror, a leader who burned through civilizations without ever stopping to truly rule. The truth? It's somewhere in between. But one thing is certain, over 2,000 years later, we're still talking about him. And that, in itself, is a kind of immortality. But before we wrap this up, let's take one final look at his legacy and what it all means. So what do we make of Alexander the Great? Was he a visionary, a tyrant, a genius? The truth is, he was all of those things at once. His dual legacy is what makes him so fascinating. He was a brilliant military mastermind, expanding his empire from Greece to India in just over a decade, shaping world history like few others. But was his empire sustainable? Not really. The moment he was gone, it crumbled into chaos. His unmatched conquests changed the ancient world, influencing civilizations for centuries. From the cities he built to the cultures he blended, his impact still echoes today. And yet, historians still ask the same enduring question: was Alexander's empire a true, lasting achievement? Or was it just the result of one man's unstoppable ambition? No matter what side of the debate you're on, one thing is clear: Alexander remains a timeless icon of strategy, power, and cultural transformation. Whether you see him as an enlightened ruler or a reckless warlord, his story is one of the most epic and influential in history. And that's why we love diving into history. It's not just about dates and battles, it's about the people, the choices they made, and the legacies they left behind. If you enjoyed this video and want more deep dives into the greatest figures and events in history, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Truth Behind History. And if you're curious about how other legendary conquerors shaped the world, check out some of my other videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.